Hello everybody, this is Dan Trotter, Pretty Good Bible Studies. The video that I am getting ready to do here is the second of two videos concerning church finance. This is part of my house church playlist, which has lots and lots and lots of videos about anything you can think of about New Testament house church ecclesiology. This particular video, I'm going to talk about Paul's three principles of finance, and then I'm going to take up three miscellaneous issues, and we'll be finished with the topic. I hope you enjoy it. All right, in the previous video, I talked about the workers' right to support, which is non-controversial and clear. Workers do have the right to support. Then I pointed out and went to a great deal of effort to show that the support was not in the form of salaries, thus making the worker into an employee of an ecclesiastical organization, but rather it was voluntary gifts given to a brother to do the job. In this particular video, we're going to talk about Paul's three principles of finance, after which we will talk about three miscellaneous issues. So let's look at Paul's three principles of finance, starting at the bottom here. First of all, Paul did not seek financial help for himself. And if we use Paul as the pattern, which I do, then that means that we shouldn't seek financial help for ourselves, because it makes it look like we're beggars or that our motives are not pure. The second of Paul's three principles is to don't receive from the ones that you minister to. I'm going to give you four churches, and I can prove it from the scriptures that Paul ministered to those churches, and he explicitly, according to what he wrote in his letters, he did not take money from the churches that he ministered to. If his pattern is one that we should emulate, and I believe it is, then we shouldn't receive money from the people that we minister to. Third principle of Paul's fundraising, of finance, is that fundraising that he did was only for poor and itinerant workers. That was the two reasons why Christians raised money for other people in the church, for poor Christians or for workers to spread the gospel. All right, let's take up principle number one. Don't seek financial help for oneself. Now, contrast that with today's practice of deputation. Missionaries go around and they say, I've got to go to Haiti and I need to raise X number of dollars, and I got a budget, and this is what I'm spending on my budget, and this is what I need. I've always found that extraordinarily distasteful, although I have given money to missionaries who've done it, but I still didn't like it. I didn't like the way they did it. Contrast that with the number one missionary of all time, in my humble opinion, Hudson Taylor. He never asked for a dime, and in fact, none of his, of all the missionaries he sent to China, none of them ever asked for money either, because he wouldn't allow it. And in fact, the Overseas Missionary Fellowship, OMF, the successor organization to Hudson Taylor's China Inland Mission, which is still in operation today. I've met one of their missionaries in China, and he was a missionary to Burma, actually. And I kept asking him, how do you support yourself? Because I'm interested in this sort of thing. You know, I'm a business professor, and I'm interested in finance and things like that. And he wouldn't answer me, and he hemmed and he hawed, and finally, and I kept pushing him, and finally he said, I tell you what, if you promise me you will not tell anybody what I'm about to tell you, I'll talk to you about it. Now, the reason he said that was because they have a strict practice in the Overseas Missionary Fellowship of not talking about their finances. And here I am about to tell the whole world on YouTube, but it's a good story, so I don't think it'll hurt their reputation at all. He said, we don't ask for money because Hudson Taylor never did and because Paul never did, and we don't. And I said, well, I thought to myself, I admire you, my man. I admire you, because that's not the way most missionaries operate. I presented Paul's three principles of finance to a church recently that was very heavily invested in mission work. They had missionaries all over the world. They're mostly short-term, and there was some long-term ones too, and they were professional mission. I mean, they were missionaries that were sent out not just by that church, but by other parachurch type organizations. And I got some blowback on this. Well, I don't know, but I go out and raise money. I told the pastor, who was a good friend of mine, I said, well, I'll just let you deal with that. That's the advantage of coming from outside and talking, you know. And he said, well, it's good that they got exposed to that. Well, I think it's very good, but I think it's freeing to let God supply your finances without you asking, people to do it, because by golly, you know when that money comes, you know it's from God. I have another apostle type guy, if you're reformed, excuse me for using that word, missionary guy, who while he was younger used to travel all over the world, and he had no money, and he never asked for money, and what he would do is he'd pray about it, and if the money didn't come in, he took that as God's direction. I'm not going to go to this country. But when the money came in, off he was on the airplane and off he went. I admire that kind of thing, and I think God honors it, because that was his plan. Paul was the apostle. That's somebody we could emulate, I think. Now, let me give a caveat here. Paul did ask for sending help. I think it was in Romans. He said, when he was writing, he was writing to the Corinthians from Ephesus, and he said, I want you to send me on my way to Rome. That just means hospitality, helping finding a ship, helping finding a travel companion, some food and lodging while you're waiting for the ship, that kind of thing. Nothing wrong with that, but I'm talking about just asking for money. He never did that. All right, the second of Paul's financial principles, if his pattern is true and should be emulated, then the pattern says this to us: don't receive from the ones ministered to. Don't receive from the people you're ministering to. Paul never did. Now, why did he do that? Why did he never receive from the ones he ministered to? So that no one could ever question his motives. If you're not taking money, nobody could ever say, oh, you're just getting rich off the gospel. Nobody could ever say that, because you're doing it for free. I think it's freeing. It's liberating. If God can supernaturally finance you, well, you don't have to do that. It is absolutely freeing. Now here, there's 4 churches that he didn't take money from when he ministered to them, and I'm going to give them to you one after the other. The first is Ephesus in Acts 20:34. Paul speaking to the Ephesian elders that he called down to the port city of Miletus, this on the way back to Jerusalem at the end of his 3rd journey. This is in Acts 20, verse 34. Paul tells the Ephesian elders, you yourselves know that these hands of mine have supplied my own needs and the needs of my companions. Paul worked with his hands, probably tent making, and he made enough money to support himself and his 8 traveling companions. But he didn't ask for money from the Ephesians. How about Corinth? 2 Corinthians 11:7, he tells the Corinthians, or did I commit a sin in humbling myself that you may be exalted, because I preached the gospel of God to you without charge? He didn't take any money from them, and in doing so, he humbled himself. Paul's a little bit sarcastic here. He's humbled himself that they may be exalted. You know, they're big shots now talking about, and apparently what they were doing is saying, Paul doesn't think enough of his money that he won't even ask money for it. He doesn't think enough of his message that he won't take money for it. It's like going to a movie for free. It reminds me, one time I went to it was the Jesus movie before the Jesus movie was famous worldwide. It had just come out. I was a teenager, and it was shown in a local theater, and it was not shown for free. We had to pay to get in, and after the movie, and it was interesting because the people who went to see the movie were Christians who were getting trained to go out and evangelize. And the brother who showed the movie said, we charge this people money to go see this movie because they think it's worth something when they pay to go see it. I don't know what I think of. In fact, the reason I still remember that after 50 years is because it griped me when he says it, and it still gripes me. I think that we're supposed to present the gospel without charge, and don't do this kind of thing. We've got to charge money so that people will think our message is worth something. Paul didn't do it. He preached the gospel of God without charges, and sure, some people said that. His teaching is worth exactly what you paid for, nothing. What you paid for to get that teaching, you paid nothing, and it's worth nothing. Well, he endured that. But if he had charged money, he would have had to face the same charge. In fact, I think he did. In Corinth, people said, you're just getting rich off the gospel. But at any rate, whatever his motives were, the pattern is clear. He did not take money from Corinth. He explicitly says it in 2 Corinthians 11:7. So that's 2 churches, the church at Ephesus and the church at Corinth, that Paul ministered to and did not take money from them, so that no one could ever question his motives. Now, the 3rd church is the church at Philippi, across the Aegean Sea there in Macedonia, on the edge of Thrace. Philippians 4:15, he says this, and you yourselves also know, Philippians, after I departed from Macedonia. No church shared with me in the matter of giving and receiving, but you alone. Now, I've got to break this down a little bit. The Philippians were right on the border of Macedonia and Thrace. If you'll picture Greece in your mind, to the east of Greece is the Aegean Sea with all those rocky islands in it. And if you'll go up the eastern coast of Greece, the next thing you'll hit is Macedonia. You're still on the coast, and you'll hit Thessalonica, which is on the coast. And the next big city up, city started by the Romans, if I remember correctly. I can't remember who started that city, but it was the Philippi. It was actually named after Alexander the Great's father, I think, Philip the Great. So I take that back about the Romans. But anyway, the city was the Philippians, and that city was either right on the edge of Macedonia or right past the border of Macedonia into Thrace, which is the next province as you go north and east. So after he left from Macedonia, what Paul means there is after he left Philippi, no church shared with him in the matter of giving and receiving, but you alone. In other words, the Philippians did share with Paul. They gave him money, but only after he departed from Philippi. And then he'd take money from them. So that's a good principle. It's fine to take money from other churches to help you out, to support you, because nobody's going to accuse you of preaching to them and getting rich off the gospel. They're not going to question your motives when it's done that way. Thessalonica is the next city down, as I just mentioned. 2 Thessalonians 3:8b through 9, Paul tells the Thessalonians that he was laboring and toiling so that we would not be a burden to any of you. We did this. We did this not because we do not have the right to such help, but in order to make ourselves a model for you to follow. Paul says, yeah, we had the right to the money, but we were trying to show you lazy Thessalonians, some of you lazy Thessalonians, who were not working because you thought the kingdom of God was about to arrive and you didn't need to work because you were going to be sitting on a throne in the Messianic kingdom. And Paul says, no, I'm not going to give you a bad example by not working. I'm going to work with my hands. All right, so Paul didn't take money from the Thessalonians that he was preaching to. Why? So that no one could ever question his motives. That's extremely important. How many people today question the motives of Kenneth Copeland, Benny Hinn? They are a laughingstock amongst people who are not snookered by their snake oil. They're a laughingstock. Well, they're worse than a laughingstock. People will point their finger at their huge mansions and say, look here, you are getting rich off the gospel. You're getting rich off of gullible people who are sending money into you. But that's never going to happen to Paul because he wouldn't take money from the people he was ministering to. All right, the third of Paul's three principles of finance, he only did fundraising for the poor and itinerant workers. For poor people, first group, and itinerant workers, second group. All right, let's look at the poor, the fundraising he did for the poor. When he was at Antioch, right before his 3 missionary journeys, I think it was before the first missionary journey. He raised money at Antioch to send down to the elders at Jerusalem because there were a lot of poor saints at Jerusalem. But several years later, there was an even bigger gift, the so-called 4 provinces gift to the poor at Jerusalem. Both times it was to raise money for the poor at Jerusalem. But this time it wasn't just in Antioch that he raised money. This time Paul got money sent from Galatia in the middle of the Anatolian Peninsula there, present-day Turkey, Galatia. He got money from there. He got money further west from the province of Asia, which is on the coast of the Aegean Sea. Then he got money from, that's the second province. Then he got money from Macedonia, the third province, and money from Achaia, Greece, the fourth provinces. Achaia, Macedonia, Asia, and Galatia. You're basically talking about a huge chunk of the Roman Empire. He sent messengers all over the place, and we know who the messengers are except for the ones from Achaia. They've got names that you can piece the names together when you read these passages here. And he gathered all that money and he sent it to Jerusalem. So that was a big deal. So raising money for the poor, like, you know, what Franklin Graham does is a wonderful thing. Samaritan's Purse. And all these people who do food bank ministries and helping the poor. That's what Christians are supposed to do. Taking care of the widows and orphans is undefiled religion. I forgot who said that. I forgot where that is. I think it was John that said that. Taking care of the widows and orphans is pure and undefiled religion. All right, so that's one thing we can raise money for in good conscience. The Lord loves it. The second thing is raise money for our itinerant workers. Now, in Acts 20:34, I've already read this verse in a different context. I'll read it again. This is Paul talking to the Ephesian elders at the port city of Miletus at the end of the third journey. Paul says this, "You yourselves know that these hands of mine have supplied my own needs and the needs of my companions." So you see, he raised money by working to support other workers besides himself. So if you give money to a worker who's spreading the gospel, you're doing a good thing. And that's not controversial. I mean, I'll just emphasize the point because that's what we need to do. We need to support people who are out there getting the work done. And by the way, it's usually a minority of Christians. It's a small, I read somewhere there's about 3,000 Protestant missionaries in the world. Only 3,000 out of all the millions of Christians there are. But they're doing a good work. Not all of them, of course, but most of them are doing a good work. So, I mean, if we got all these millions of Christians and just a few workers out there, maybe we should raise enough money to support them so they can do their job. Instead of spending money on multi-million-dollar crystal cathedrals. All right, let's look at 3 miscellaneous issues real quick and we'll finish up. First of all, the question of bivocational workers. Bivocational workers, that's workers who work part-time and then serve the church with the rest of their time. Now, a lot of people look down on that. Folks, there is nothing unspiritual about a bivocational worker. Nothing. And I'm going to show it to you right now. In Acts 20:34, I've quoted this verse in 2 other contexts. I'm going to quote it again. This is Paul talking to the Ephesian elders at Miletus. And he says, "You yourselves know that these hands ministered to my necessities and to those who were with me." Now, that means Paul was working. The Apostle Paul, who was raised up into the third heaven and saw visions of Jesus, was he unspiritual? He didn't think it was anything bad about working part-time. He also worked in Corinth, I think, with Priscilla and Aquila. Again, so he wouldn't have to take money from the Corinthians. He was bivocational. He was a bivocational apostle. And so we should look down on pastors who work. I'll tell you this. I know I heard a story about a young man who was studying to be a pastor, a traditional church pastor in Columbia Theological Seminary in Decatur, Georgia. And he was sitting in his beginning class, and the financial person who ran the finances of the ministry of the seminary got up and she said, "All you guys out there, you want to make a living being a preacher, you better forget about it. You better think bivocational because that's where everything's going now." And I've heard through the podcast world, I've been listening, that's what's happening. It's getting harder and harder to find a job as a full-time pastor, which to me is fine because I don't believe in full-time paid pastors anyway. But bivocational workers, that means basically you're a bivocational elder. It's harder to do that when you're an apostle, when you're traveling, but it can be done. But especially if you're an elder because you're local, what makes it difficult is you got to trade off time. You got to trade off money for time. You got to take a lower salary to take a part-time job, and then of course, hopefully, the church will, with their voluntary donations, will make up the lack so that the elder can support his family and live a decent life. Theoretically and ideally, that's how it should be done. The problem is that part-time workers are not seen as premium type workers by a lot of businesses. It's difficult for them. However, look at Walmart. They hire a lot of part-time workers. So, I mean, it's not like it's impossible. It might be difficult, but it's not impossible. Now, let me ask you this. Was Paul less than spiritual because he was a bivocational worker? I don't think so. Second miscellaneous issue is accountability. Now, there's a good scripture that shows why workers need to be accountable about money. Workers did not handle money alone. I mean, that is a no-no. I mean, I was at a small church one time, and I did the books. I handled the finances for a long time, and by golly, I was sensitive about that. I didn't want to you know, what is it? You have to have accountability practices where you have two people sign the checks and that kind of thing. Somebody besides you looking at the books. But don't let one person handle money alone. The temptation's too great. And besides, even if you're honest like yours truly and never stole anything, what if somebody accused me of it? Well, how am I going to prove it? I got to go through all the books. I mean, I just talked to a great missionary who had started a couple churches on the foreign field, and he was accused of spending money, donations where the money was not donated to. It was a baseless charge. It was a scurrilous charge. It was a libelous charge. And by golly, he had to vindicate himself. And if I remember the story, he got whoever was handling the books, and they had it all out there documented, and he just took it to the church when they had the big the big meeting to decide who was going to get booted. He had it all there, right there. He was justified. He was vindicated. So this is for anybody that's dealing with money and finance. I remember hearing a story one time about a church worker. I mean, the Chinese church, they don't have a lot of money, and some worker in the church and they have these networks, and he was responsible for 50 gazillion people. I forgot how many, and somebody went to the back of his car and opened up the trunk, and there's a whole trunk full of loose cash, American dollars. Well, I assume he was getting ready to invest. Oh, I got even a better story. This is personally with me. I gave money to an orphanage, and the money the way I did it was I purchased some, some rugs that were done by Christian sisters in a church near Beijing, outside of Beijing, and they had made the rugs by sewing, and they were pretty rugs. They were silk, and the labor was incredible. How much labor they put into them. So I'm sure they were worth something. But I paid more than they were worth because I wanted to give the money to the orphanage. And all of a sudden, I get a call from a guy in California, and the girl I gave the money to was going around, and she had summaries of Watchman Nee's teaching and a kind of like a catechism or like a syllabus, and she was teaching all these people all over Beijing. And she was vouched for by another old gentleman who was a leader in the Chinese house church, and that leader stayed with me in my house, and I got to know him, and of course, you talk about trusting. I trusted that woman completely. I get a call, I don't know, several months after I'd given that money, from a guy in California who had started the orphanage on the outskirts of Beijing. And he said that this spiritual Christian woman that I had given that money to had taken my money, along with other money that she had stolen from the orphanage, put it all in a fund, and bought a down payment on a house. Well, she got caught, and she gave the money back, and the orphanage got their money back. Thank God. But I'm telling you, if that woman can steal money, anybody can steal money. I trusted her probably more than as much as I trusted my wife. I mean, I just, to this day, I can hardly believe that she stole from little kids in an orphanage, and they were disabled kids to boot. So anyway, enough of that. You don't handle money alone, because for two reasons. One, so that you won't be tempted to steal it, and two, if somebody falsely accuses you, you got the documentation to prove that you didn't steal the money. Now, what did Paul do? 1 Corinthians 16, 2 and 3. This is for the four promises gift that he wants to collect from the Corinthians when he makes his way there on the way before he goes back to Jerusalem at the end of the third journey. And Paul tells the Corinthians this: on the first day of every week, let each one of you put aside and save as he may prosper, that no collections be made when I come. And when I arrive, whomever you may approve, I shall send them with letters to carry your gift to Jerusalem. Now, there's a lot of interesting stuff in this passage. And I'm going to point out the safeguards that Paul used to guard his integrity. First of all, he didn't raise the money himself. He said, let each one of you put aside and save. He didn't go to to Corinth and say, I'm going to raise some money. Well, people could say, yeah, you're raising money to take it to the people in Jerusalem, but you're going to spend it on yourself, Paul. Nobody's going to say that to him, because the Corinthians raised the money. He didn't raise it. It says, when I arrive, whomever you may approve. He didn't choose the messengers that were going to carry that money to Jerusalem. He let the Corinthians choose the messengers so that no one could accuse him of using his cronies to get the money. He was just as safe as he could be. And then what's the next thing he did? He had more than one messenger carry the money. He says, I shall send them, these messengers, not just one, but them, so they could be mutually accountable, so they could watch out for each other. I shall send them to Jerusalem. And last of all, he sent a letter with the money, and the letter probably vouchsafed the integrity of the messengers. He's probably saying, the church at Corinth at my behest has approved these messengers. You can trust them. And he probably, almost beyond a shadow of a doubt, in my opinion, he recorded the amount of the offering so that the messengers couldn't pilfer any of it, so that it would all be there when it got to Corinth. Paul was no dummy. I always say, I used to practice law, and I used to say, I don't care if you're doing business with your mother, your father, your brother, your sister, or your wife. I don't care who it is. You put it in writing and get the paper trail there so there's accountability. And plus, people's memories fail too, even innocently. So be careful when you handle money. So anyway, that's my sermon on accountability. Let's look at the third miscellaneous issue. What about the perennial question of holding goods in common? Does the Bible suggest that we should do that? No, this was not a New Testament pattern. It was done only one time in the New Testament. That's in Acts 4. That was in Jerusalem after Pentecost. And one time is not a pattern. Why was it done that one time? Well, here's a possible reason it was done at Pentecost. Many pilgrims had come from all over the empire, and upon their salvation, they had no place to stay because they were visitors. They were guests from out of town. They had no place to work because they were visitors. No place to work, no place to stay. They could starve to death. So the church held everything in common because it was an exciting time of Holy Spirit revival. We are finished with church finance. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you stay tuned for future videos concerning house church, New Testament ecclesiology.